He bent saplings to build a bark longhouse for $0. Gunnar Halvorsen, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried 2 wives to the cold, told him plainly, "Your sticks and bark will scatter across the prairie like paper. Those children in the valley will freeze to death if anyone listens to your nonsense." He had nothing, no allies, and needed to shelter 50 people who refused to help him. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. But 7 months earlier, Silas Mercer had never built anything larger than a lean-to in his life. The man who stumbled into the settlement of Dalton Crossing in May of 1887 looked like something the prairie had chewed up and spat out. His coat was more patch than cloth. His boots had been resoled so many times the leather had forgotten its original shape. He carried a hatchet, a bedroll, and nothing else. The settlers watched him from doorways and fence posts. They had seen drifters before, men burned out by the frontier, heading nowhere in particular. This one was different. He moved wrong. His gait had a looseness to it, a rhythm that didn't match the stiff-backed German and Norwegian farmers who worked this land. And his eyes. His eyes tracked the horizon the way a hawk tracks movement in grass. Gunnar Halvorsen was the first to speak to him. Halvorsen had survived 11 Dakota winters. He had buried 2 wives to the cold, one in 1879, one in 83. When Halvorsen spoke about survival on the northern plains, men listened. "You looking for work?" Halvorsen asked. The stranger shook his head. "Looking for a place to build." "Build what?" "Shelter." Halvorsen studied him. The man's accent was strange, not foreign exactly, but shaped by something other than English. Words came out rounder, slower, as if he was translating from some internal language. "You got money for lumber? Nails? Glass?" "Don't need them." Halvorsen laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. "Mister, I don't know where you came from, but out here you build with what the railroad brings or you build with sod. There's no third option." The stranger looked past Halvorsen toward the creek bottom, where a thick stand of elms threw shadows across the water. "There's always a third option," he said. "Most people just forgot it." That was how Dalton Crossing met Silas Mercer. Within a week, everyone in the valley knew his story, or the version of it that spread from porch to porch like fire through dry grass. He had been a fur trapper. That much was certain. The old-timers recognized the look. Men who had lived in the mountains before the beaver trade collapsed, before the army forts, before the railroad made the wilderness into something that could be measured and sold. But Mercer's story went further than most. 15 years, people said. 15 years living among the Haudenosaunee in New York before heading west. The word spread in whispers. Squaw man. A white man who had gone native, who had married an Indian woman, lived in Indian houses, eaten Indian food, learned Indian ways, and then lost everything, wife, children, tribe, to the diseases that swept through the reservations like scythes through wheat. Now he was here, 53 years old, alone, with nothing but a hatchet and knowledge that nobody wanted. The first thing Silas Mercer did was walk the creek bottom. He moved slowly, touching bark, testing branches, crouching to examine the soil. The settlers who watched him from a distance assumed he was touched in the head. Old Henrik Dahl told his wife the stranger was probably looking for a place to lie down and die. But Mercer wasn't dying. He was counting. Elm trees. He needed elms, big ones, with thick bark that would peel clean when the sap ran in spring. He found 47 mature elms within a mile of the creek. Each tree would yield 4 to 8 sheets of bark, depending on diameter. He did the math in his head. 390 sheets, minimum. Enough. Then he counted saplings. The second growth forest along the creek was thick with young trees, elm, ash, willow, straight and flexible, 2 to 3 inches across. Perfect for bending. He would need over 600 of them. Finally, he paced out the building site. Flat ground, well-drained, sheltered from the north wind by a low ridge. 100 feet long, 20 feet wide, room for 50 people, maybe 80 if they packed in tight. Mercer stood in the center of the empty ground and looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving wrong, too fast for May, too many coming from the northwest. He had seen skies like this before, not here, but in the Finger Lakes country where the Haudenosaunee had lived for 1,000 years. Skies that promised a hard winter, skies that said, prepare now or die later. He had 7 months, maybe less. Gunnar Halvorsen found Mercer the next morning, already cutting saplings from the creek bottom. You're serious, Halvorsen said. It wasn't a question. Mercer didn't stop working. His hatchet bit into a young elm, and the tree came down with a crack. Winter's coming hard this year. I can smell it. Winter's always hard here. Not like this one. Mercer dragged the sapling to a growing pile. The last 2 years, warm winters, light snow. That's ending. The pattern's shifting. I've seen it before. Halvorsen crossed his arms. You can smell the weather 7 months out? I can read it. The way the birds are moving, the way the bark's growing thick on the north side of the trees. The mice are digging deeper than usual. Mercer straightened and looked at Halvorsen. Your sod roofs won't hold. The words hung in the air. Halvorsen's jaw tightened. His own house was sod, 14 by 16 feet, walls 3 feet thick, roof made of cottonwood poles covered with tar paper, and 2 layers of prairie earth. It had kept him alive through 11 winters, 2 dead wives, yes, but he had survived. Our roofs have held fine, Halvorsen said. They've held through light winters, 30 inches of snow, maybe 40. What happens when you get 60, 70? Mercer pointed toward the Halvorsen homestead, visible on the rise a quarter-mile away. Your roof is carrying 30 pounds per square foot right now, just from the sod. Add 2 feet of wet snow on a flat surface that can't shed it. That's another 40 pounds. Your cottonwood rafters can handle maybe 80 total. Do the math. Halvorsen's face went red. I don't need some. He stopped himself, swallowed, started again. I don't need a drifter telling me how to build. I've buried 2 wives out here. I know what winter can do. Then you know I'm right. What I know, Halvorsen said slowly, is that you're building something that looks like an Indian wigwam. And I know that when the real cold comes, when it drops to 40 below and the wind blows 60 miles an hour, your bent sticks and tree bark will scatter across the prairie like paper. And if anyone is fool enough to shelter inside, they'll freeze to death. He stepped closer to Mercer. I've seen men like you before, men who think they know better because they lived with the savages. But this isn't New York. This is Dakota. The cold here will kill you. And those children in the valley, the Lindgren children, the Muller children, the Dahl children, they'll be dead right alongside you if anyone listens to your nonsense. Mercer didn't flinch. Then don't listen, he said. But when your roof comes down, you'll know where to find me. Halvorsen turned and walked away. He didn't look back. But Mercer noticed that Halvorsen kept his children inside that night, even though the weather was warm, and the next morning the old man was on his roof, checking the rafters. The settlement of Dalton Crossing had 23 families. Most were recent arrivals, Scandinavians and Germans who had flooded into Dakota Territory after the railroad opened the land. They had come with dreams of cheap acreage and independence. What they had found was grass, wind, and a kind of isolation that broke something inside the unprepared. Their houses told the story of their poverty: sod walls, dirt floors, roofs that leaked when it rained and sagged when it snowed. A 14 by 16-foot soddy cost almost nothing to build, just labor and time. But it also kept almost nothing out. In summer, the walls crawled with insects. In winter, frost formed on the inside surfaces. The only heat came from cook stoves burning buffalo chips or twisted hay, and on the coldest nights the heat rose straight through the flat roofs and vanished into the black sky. Nebraska's population had doubled in the last decade, from 452,000 to over 1 million, and most of those new arrivals had come with nothing. The railroad advertisements promised paradise. The reality was this: families who had arrived in boxcars eating sausage and crackers, who had dug their homes from the earth itself because lumber cost more than they would earn in a year. And winter was always waiting. The winter of 1886 to 87 had been harsh. The winter before that, worse. Old-timers spoke of the winter of 1880, when the temperature hit 58 below zero and cattle froze standing up in the fields. But even the old-timers admitted something felt different about the coming year. The summer of 87 was too hot. The fall, too dry. The geese were flying south 3 weeks early. No one said it aloud, but everyone was counting their resources: fuel, food, the thickness of their walls, the strength of their roofs. And at the edge of the settlement, Silas Mercer bent saplings into shapes no one recognized. By June, the frame was starting to take form, and the whispers had turned to open mockery. Peter Olmsted came to investigate. Olmsted was a carpenter from Minnesota who had built 17 sod houses across the territory. He understood construction, angles, load-bearing, the mathematics of keeping walls upright and roofs intact. He walked around Mercer's growing structure 3 times before speaking. "What is this supposed to be?" Mercer was lashing a horizontal pole to the arched rafters. He had bent 24 saplings into perfect curves, their tips meeting at a ridgeline 20 feet above the ground. The skeleton looked like the ribcage of some enormous animal. "Shelter," Mercer said. "Shelter for who?" "This thing is—" Olmsted paced off the length. 100 feet? You're building 100-foot shelter out of sticks?" "Saplings, bent green, lashed tight. The curve distributes load through compression, not bending. Same principle as a stone arch, but with wood." Olmsted shook his head. "Saplings can't bear weight. First heavy snow, this whole thing collapses." "It won't." "You're telling me bent sticks are stronger than cottonwood beams?" Mercer stopped working. He climbed down from the frame and faced Olmsted directly. "I'm telling you that a curved surface sheds snow. A flat surface catches it. Your sod roofs are flat because steep angles would slide the sod right off, so you're trapped. You can't make them shed, and you can't make them hold. The only question is which winter breaks them. Our roofs have held for light winters. The Haudenosaunee have been building longhouses for 1,000 years. The same design, the same materials, through winters that make Dakota look gentle. Their roofs don't collapse, their walls don't cave in, because they understood something your European ancestors forgot. You can't fight the weight of snow. You have to let it slide." Olmsted looked at the curved frame. Up close, he could see the precision of it. The saplings spaced exactly 4 feet apart, the horizontal poles creating a grid that distributed tension across the entire structure. It wasn't random, it wasn't primitive, it was engineered. But admitting that meant admitting something else, something Olmsted wasn't prepared to say aloud. "If you're right," Olmsted said slowly, "then every house in this valley is a death trap." Mercer picked up his hatchet and climbed back onto the frame. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Olmsted left without another word, but Mercer noticed him on his own roof that evening, measuring the sag in the center where the rafters had bowed under last year's snow. The bark harvest began in late June, when the sap ran freely and the outer layers of the elms could be peeled in large sheets. Mercer worked alone. He would circle a mature tree, cutting through the outer bark with his hatchet, then wedging the blade beneath the layer and prying it away in sections 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. Each tree yielded 4 to 8 sheets. Each sheet weighed 40 pounds when wet. He needed 390 sheets. The work destroyed his hands. By the second week, his palms were a mass of blisters and calluses, the skin split and bleeding in half a dozen places. He wrapped them in strips torn from his shirt and kept cutting. The elm groves were a mile from his building site, and he dragged each load back by hand, stacking the bark flat and weighting it with stones to prevent curling. No one helped him. The settlement watched from a distance, women gossiping over wash basins, men pausing at fence posts to shake their heads. The children were the only ones who came close. They would crouch at the edge of the clearing, watching Mercer work, until their parents called them away. "Don't talk to him," the mothers said. "He's not right in the head." But the children kept watching. There was something hypnotic about the work, the rhythm of the hatchet, the slow growth of the structure, the transformation of raw materials into something deliberate and strange. 12-year-old Anna Lindgren told her younger brother it looked like a whale skeleton. Her brother said it looked like a church without walls. Their mother heard them and made them pray for forgiveness. By August, the frame was complete. 625 saplings, bent and lashed into 40 arched ribs spanning 20 feet, anchored to 2 parallel rows of upright posts running 100 feet. Horizontal poles connected the ribs every 3 feet, creating a structural grid visible from a quarter-mile away. Reverend Josiah Crane came to deliver his verdict. Crane was not from Dalton Crossing. He rode a circuit through 5 settlements, bringing the gospel to scattered homesteads that couldn't support a permanent church. He was a thin man with a thin voice and eyes that seemed to find sin wherever they looked. He had been preaching against the Indian threat for 15 years, not the physical threat, which the army had mostly eliminated, but the spiritual threat, the contamination, the danger that Christian settlers might absorb pagan ways and lose their souls. He stood before Mercer's structure with his hands clasped behind his back. "I know what this is," Crane said. Mercer was on the frame, lashing bark to the skeleton. He didn't stop working. "It's a longhouse. It's an abomination." Crane's voice carried across the clearing, and settlers who had been keeping their distance drifted closer to listen. "The Lord commanded us to multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, to bring civilization to the wilderness, not to regress, not to build heathen structures, not to return to the darkness from which we came." Mercer kept working. "I've heard about you," Crane continued. "The squaw man, the savage lover. You lived with them, didn't you? Married one of their women? Worshipped their gods?" "I learned from them." Mercer's voice was flat. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Crane turned to address the gathered settlers. "This man wants you to shelter in an Indian house, to crawl into a pagan structure when the cold comes, to abandon the homes your own hands built, Christian homes, honest homes, and huddle like animals in a cave of sticks and bark." He pointed at Mercer. "If anyone enters this abomination, they will answer to God for it. And when it collapses, and it will collapse, their blood will be on this man's hands." Mercer finally stopped working. He looked down at Crane from the top of the frame. "When the roofs come down," he said, "you come find me. We'll see whose hands have blood on them." Crane left. but his word stayed. That night, Mercer saw lanterns burning late in the settlement, families talking, arguing, making decisions. By morning, 2 families had announced they were leaving, heading back east before winter. Getting out while they still could. The others stayed. They had no choice. They were too poor to leave, too invested to abandon their claims, too stubborn to admit they had made a mistake coming here. They would trust their sod roofs and their cottonwood rafters and their faith that God would protect the faithful. And they would not, could not, enter the madman's tunnel. September brought the first frost, and Mercer's hands finally began to heal as he shifted from cutting to construction. The bark application was precise work, each sheet laid rough side out, overlapping the one below like shingles on a roof, lashed to the frame with strips of basswood bark that he had soaked until they were pliable as rope. The double frame system came next, lighter poles laid over the bark and tied at the eaves, sandwiching the covering between inner and outer layers. This was the engineering secret the settlers couldn't see. The bark wasn't just nailed to the frame, it was held by the frame, pressed between 2 layers of wood that prevented wind from lifting it. The Haudenosaunee had developed this system over centuries, learning from every failure, refining until the structure could withstand winds that flattened European houses. The work went faster than Mercer expected. The rhythm of it soothed him, the repetitive motions, the visible progress, the growing solidity of the structure. By late September, the exterior was complete. 100 feet long, 20 feet wide, 20 feet high at the crown, covered entirely in overlapping bark that had dried to the color of old leather. From the inside, light filtered through the smoke holes, 5 of them, spaced 20 feet apart along the ridge line, each covered with a bark flap that could be adjusted for weather. The floor was packed earth. The central aisle ran the full length, 10 feet wide, with fire pits dug at each smoke hole location. Sleeping platforms lined both walls. Wooden frames raised a foot off the ground, wide enough for a family to sleep side by side, with storage shelves above. 2,000 square feet of interior space, larger than every cabin in Dalton Crossing combined. Mercer stood in the center and looked up at the curve of the roof. The bark was already shedding the morning dew, water beading and running down the slope, dripping from the eaves rather than soaking through. It would do the same with snow. The physics were simple. Anything that hit the steep lower walls would slide off immediately. Anything that landed on the flatter crown would be caught momentarily, then released as the bark flexed and the structure shed its load. But the settlers wouldn't see it work until the test came, and by then it might be too late for them to believe. October brought something unexpected. Help. Astrid Lindgren was 34 years old, a widow with 3 children, surviving on a quarter section of marginal land that barely produced enough grain to feed her family. Her husband had died 2 winters ago, pneumonia, brought on by working in the cold to fix a roof that had already begun to sag. She was exactly the kind of settler who should have been most afraid of Silas Mercer. Instead, she appeared at the Longhouse one morning with a proposition. "I have 40 pounds of flour I can't use before it spoils," she said, "and my children need something to do besides worry about winter." Mercer looked at her. Her dress was patched, her face was thin. The flour was probably half her food supply, and she was offering it to him. "I don't need charity," he said. "It's not charity, it's trade." Astrid gestured at the Longhouse. "You're building shelter for 50 people. My children are 3 of those people. Whether I like it or not, whether the reverend likes it or not, if the roofs come down this winter, we're coming here, so let us help." Mercer studied her face. The fear was there, he could see it, the same fear that kept the rest of the settlement away. But something else was stronger, survival instinct. The knowledge that pride was a luxury the frontier didn't allow. The smoke holes need weatherproofing, he said finally, and I need firewood, more than I can cut alone. Astrid nodded. My children can haul wood. I can help with the smoke holes. People will talk. People already talk. She looked at the longhouse, its curved roof glowing in the autumn light. They talk about the squaw man and his Indian tunnel. They say it'll collapse. They say anyone inside will freeze. She turned back to Mercer. I don't know what will happen, but I know what happened to my husband when our roof sagged and he went out in the cold to fix it. I know what happens when you trust a flat roof in a hard winter. Her voice was steady. My children are not dying in a sod house. If that means I'm going to hell, I'll see you there. Mercer allowed himself a small smile. It was the first time he had smiled since arriving in Dalton Crossing. Start with the firewood, he said. We need at least 30 cords. November arrived like a warning. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single week. The creek froze solid. Geese that should have been gone weeks ago finally fled south in ragged formations, their honking carrying across the silent prairie like signals of retreat. Mercer watched the sky constantly now. The clouds were wrong, thick and dark, stacking up on the northwestern horizon, building into formations he had seen only twice before in his life. Both times what followed had killed people. The longhouse was almost ready. Interior platforms complete. 5 fire pits lined with river stones. 23 cords of firewood stacked beneath the sleeping platforms and in the end compartments. Astrid's 3 children, Anna, Eric, and little Marta, had worked alongside him for weeks, hauling wood, gathering grass for insulation, helping him seal the gaps where bark met bark. The settlement had noticed. The whispers had shifted from mockery to something more complicated, a mixture of curiosity and resentment and fear. No one else offered to help, but no one threw rocks anymore either. Mercer calculated his supplies. 23 cords of firewood, enough for 50 people for 3 weeks, maybe 4 if they were careful. He needed 30 to be safe. The weather wasn't giving him time. On November 12th, the first hard blizzard hit. Not the real test, not yet, but a warning shot. 18 inches of snow in 6 hours. Winds gusting to 40 miles an hour. Temperature dropping from 20 above to 15 below by nightfall. Mercer spent the storm inside the longhouse, feeding the fires, watching the structure perform. The bark creaked in the wind, but held. Snow piled against the lower walls, then slid off as the surface steepened. The crown collected a few inches, then shed them in miniature avalanches that hissed down the slopes. Inside, the temperature held at 42 degrees with 2 fires burning. Not warm, but survivable. With 5 fires and body heat from 50 people, it would be warmer. The storm passed. Mercer went outside to check the damage. Nothing. No structural damage. No leaks. The smoke holes had stayed clear. The bark sandwich had held against the wind. But when he looked toward the settlement, his stomach tightened. 2 roofs had sagged noticeably. One had a visible crack running across the center. The cottonwood rafters bent beyond their design load. No collapses yet. The snow hadn't been heavy enough. But the damage was there, and it was cumulative. Each storm would add weight. Each sag would deepen. The settlement was one bad blizzard away from catastrophe. Mercer walked to the edge of the clearing and looked at the families working to shovel snow from their roofs. They were using shovels and poles and bare hands, trying to reduce the load before it crushed them. The Miller family, the Lindgrens, Astrid's in-laws, who had cut her off after she started helping Mercer, the Halvorsen homestead, where Gunnar himself was on the roof despite his 63 years, pushing snow over the edge with a fury that looked like desperation. None of them looked at Mercer. None of them asked for help. He went back to the Longhouse and started cutting more firewood. December was worse. 2 more blizzards, each heavier than the last. Moorhead recorded 20 inches. Morris got 39.5. Mankato measured 33. The snow didn't melt between storms. It compacted, layer on layer, adding weight to roofs that were never designed to bear it. On December 15th, the Muller roof collapsed. No one was killed. The Mullers had seen the crack widening and moved their bedding to the far corner, away from the center where the sag was deepest. When the rafters finally gave way at 3 a.m, the family scrambled out through the door and stood in the snow watching their home die. 3 tons of frozen sod and snow crashed through the center of the cabin, crushing the table where they had eaten dinner, burying the stove that had kept them alive. Everything they owned was under the rubble. The Millers sheltered with the Lindgrens, not Astrid's family, but the other Lindgrens, who had a larger soddy. 9 people now in a space meant for 5. They would survive, but barely, and winter hadn't truly arrived. January 5th brought the sleet storm. Freezing rain fell for 8 hours, coating every surface with an inch of ice. The snow that had accumulated on roofs now had a frozen shell, trapping it in place. Weight that might have blown away in wind or sublimated in sun was now locked down, pressing harder with every passing hour. Mercer counted the days. He had been tracking the temperature patterns all winter, comparing them to the rhythms he remembered from his years in the East. The pattern was building toward something. A pressure system was forming somewhere over the Rockies, and warm air was pushing up from the Gulf. When those 2 forces collided over the plains, the result would be catastrophic. He had maybe a week, maybe less. 27 cords of firewood stacked inside the Longhouse, 3 cords short of his target. He could cut more, but his body was failing, his hands cracked and bleeding again, his back a constant ache, his weight down 15 pounds since summer. Astrid found him collapsed against a woodpile on January 8th, barely conscious, his hatchet still clutched in his hand. "You'll kill yourself," she said, helping him to his feet. "Winter will kill everyone if I don't finish." "The Longhouse is finished. It's been finished for weeks." "The firewood isn't." He leaned against her, too exhausted to pretend otherwise. 3 cords short. If the storm lasts more than 3 weeks, then we'll burn the sleeping platforms. Then we'll burn the storage shelves. Astrid's voice was steady. "You built something that will stand, Silas. Now you have to live long enough to use it." She half carried him back to the Longhouse. Inside, her children had 2 fires burning. The temperature was 51 degrees warmer than any sod house in the valley. Mercer slept for 14 hours. When he woke, the sky to the northwest was clear. That scared him more than anything. On January 11th, 1888, the temperature in Dakota Territory climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks. In Huron, the mercury touched the 40s. In Valentine, it reached 30 degrees by dawn. Children who had been trapped indoors for months ran outside in their shirt sleeves. Farmers who had been burning furniture to stay warm ventured out to check on livestock. The little schoolhouse in Dalton Crossing opened its windows for the first time since November. The relief was overwhelming. Settlers laughed for the first time in weeks. Wives hung laundry on lines that hadn't been used since fall. Reverend Crane declared it a sign of God's mercy. Silas Mercer stood outside the Longhouse and watched the sky. The warmth was wrong. The pressure had been dropping for 3 days. The wind was shifting, not the steady northwest wind of winter, but something more chaotic, gusting from multiple directions like a system trying to decide what it wanted to be. He had seen this before. Once in 1864 in the Finger Lakes, once in 1871 in Minnesota. Both times the warmth had lasted a day. Both times, what followed had killed people faster than they could run. Mercer started hauling firewood into the Longhouse, load after load, until his arms trembled and his vision blurred. Astrid's children joined him without being asked. By evening, they had moved the last of the exterior woodpile inside. 30 cords, still short. But it would have to be enough. "Something's coming," Anna said. She was 12 years old, but her eyes had the look of someone much older. "Isn't it?" Mercer looked at the sky. The sun was setting red, too red, filtered through ice crystals that shouldn't have been there. "Yes. Will the Longhouse hold?" He put a hand on her shoulder. "I built it to hold. Now we find out if I built it right." That night, the temperature stayed warm, 40 degrees at midnight, 42 at dawn. Settlers who had run out of fuel let their fires die, grateful for the reprieve. The morning of January 12th dawned clear and mild. Children walked to school without coats. The teacher opened all the windows, letting fresh air into a room that had been sealed tight for months. On the horizon, a dark line appeared. Silas Mercer saw it first. He was standing on the ridge above the Longhouse, watching the northwest, when the wall of cloud appeared. Not cloud, something else. A moving barrier of white and gray, stretching from horizon to horizon, advancing faster than a horse could run. He started running toward the settlement. He made it 100 yards before the temperature dropped. And then the great white death arrived. The cold front hit Dalton Crossing at 11 minutes past 10 on the morning of January 12th, 1888. The temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. Silas Mercer was 50 yards from the schoolhouse when the wall struck. One moment the air was mild, almost warm, carrying the smell of melting snow. The next moment the world turned white, and the cold hit his lungs like a fist. He staggered, lost his footing, went down on one knee in snow that was already being scoured by wind he couldn't see coming. The snow was different from any blizzard he had experienced. Fine as sifted flour, the settlers would say later, those who survived to say anything. It didn't fall. It flew. Horizontal. Driven by winds that gusted past 60 miles an hour, packing into every gap in clothing, every crack in walls, every space between scarf and skin. It froze eyelids shut. It filled nostrils and mouths. It turned the air itself into something that couldn't be breathed. Visibility dropped to nothing. Mercer could not see his own hands. He crawled forward on instinct, trying to reach the schoolhouse, trying to warn the teacher to keep the children inside. But the schoolhouse was gone, swallowed by white, erased from the world as completely as if it had never existed. He turned back. The Longhouse was a quarter-mile behind him, uphill, invisible. He had maybe 10 minutes before the cold killed him, maybe less. Mercer stood and walked into the wind. Inside the schoolhouse, 17 children huddled against the walls while their teacher, a 23-year-old woman named Clara Erickson, tried to decide if they would live or die. The stove had gone out. The building was a simple frame structure, boards and tar paper, no insulation, windows that rattled in their frames. The temperature inside was dropping by the minute. Clara could see frost forming on the children's breath. She could see the smallest ones beginning to shiver uncontrollably. She had two choices. Keep them here, where the building offered some shelter from the wind but no warmth, or try to move them to safety. But safety was scattered across a settlement she could no longer see, in homes she could no longer find. The Miller children were crying. Their house was gone, collapsed 2 weeks ago, and they had been staying with the Lindgrens. But where were the Lindgrens? Which direction? How far? Clara made a decision. She tied the children together with a rope from the supply closet, spacing them 3 feet apart, the oldest at the front and back. She wrapped the smallest ones in every coat and blanket she could find. Then she opened the door. The wind nearly ripped it from her hands. Snow poured into the schoolhouse like water through a broken dam. Clara stepped into the white and felt the world disappear. She had no idea which way to walk. Silas Mercer reached the Longhouse by dead reckoning. He had paced the distance 100 times, 320 steps from the ridge to the door, bearing northwest, accounting for the slope. He walked blind, counting, his hands stretched before him like a man searching for a wall in darkness. At step 290, his hands touched bark. He felt along the wall until he found the entrance, a double flap system of overlapping bark panels that blocked wind while allowing passage. He pushed through and collapsed on the floor inside. Warmth, relative warmth, 48 degrees, dropping as the storm sucked heat through the smoke holes, but warm enough to survive. Astrid was there with her children, feeding the fires. 2 other families had arrived before the full force hit, the Dahls and the Sorensens. 8 people total who had seen the wall coming and run. "The school," Mercer gasped. "The children." Astrid's face went white. Her niece and nephew, her dead husband's brother's children, attended that school. "You can't go out there," she said. "You'll die. They'll die if someone doesn't find them." Mercer pulled himself to his feet. His hands were already burning with cold damage, the skin cracked and weeping. "I need rope, as much as you have." He went out twice. The first time, he found nothing. The storm was too dense, the wind too disorienting. He walked 200 steps in what he thought was the direction of the schoolhouse and found only empty prairie, the snow already drifting to waist height. He turned back, following the rope he had tied to the Longhouse door, and barely made it inside before his legs gave out. The second time, he heard voices. Faint, almost lost in the wind, children crying, an adult shouting. He followed the sound, rope trailing behind him, until he stumbled into something solid. A body. Clara Erickson collapsed in the snow, still clutching the rope that held her students together. 4 children had already broken free. Mercer couldn't look for them, couldn't see, couldn't spare the time. He grabbed the rope and started pulling, dragging the teacher and the 13 children still attached toward the only shelter that existed. The walk back took 45 minutes. By the time he reached the Longhouse, 2 of the children were unconscious. Clara couldn't stand. Mercer himself was snowblind, his vision reduced to a gray haze that wouldn't clear for 3 days. But they were alive. 13 children and 1 teacher, added to the 11 already inside, 28 people in a structure built for 50. The night was just beginning. By midnight, the Longhouse held 43 people. They came in waves, stumbling through the blizzard toward the only light visible in the valley, the glow of fire through the smoke holes, faint but unmistakable against the absolute darkness of the storm. The Lindgrens arrived first, carrying their youngest daughter, who had stopped shivering an hour ago. The Petersons came next, the father half carrying his pregnant wife. Then the Mullers, already homeless, now seeking shelter for the second time in a month. Each arrival brought news of the settlement. The Hansen roof had collapsed at noon. The Olsen family was trapped inside their soddy, the door buried under a drift. The Bjorkman cabin had caught fire when the stovepipe blew down. They had escaped, but their home was gone, and the Halvorsen homestead was silent. No one had seen Gunnar or his family since morning. Mercer organized the survivors with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Families assigned to sleeping platforms along the walls, 2 feet per person, children in the middle for warmth. Fires fed in rotation, 1 cord of wood per day, strictly rationed. Snow melted for drinking water. The sick and injured placed closest to the center aisle where the heat was strongest. Little Eric Lindgren, Astrid's son, developed a fever by evening. He had been outside too long, helping to haul firewood before the storm hit. Now he lay on a platform near the central fire, his breathing shallow and fast, his skin hot to the touch. "He needs a doctor," Astrid said. "There is no doctor." Mercer knelt beside the boy, checking his pulse. Rapid. Too rapid. "There's no one for 50 miles who can help. We keep him warm, keep him hydrated, and pray." "I don't know how to pray anymore." "Then just keep him warm." The storm raged outside. Inside, 43 people listened to the wind tear at the bark walls and waited to learn if the structure would hold. The Longhouse held. Through the night of January 12th, through the howling dawn of the 13th, through 3 more days of intermittent snow and constant cold, the temperature outside dropped to 40 below zero. The wind eased by the second day, but never stopped entirely, scouring the prairie clean of loose snow, piling drifts against anything that stood in its path. The sod houses of Dalton Crossing were buried. Some had collapsed outright, the Hansen cabin, the Olsen place, 2 others that no one could identify beneath the drifts. Others stood damaged, their roofs sagging, their doors blocked by snow walls 8 feet high. No one could reach them. No one could repair them. The settlement had effectively ceased to exist, but the Longhouse performed exactly as designed. Snow hit the curved walls and slid off. Drifts piled against the lower sections but couldn't climb the steep surface. The bark flexed in the wind but didn't tear, held fast by the double-frame sandwich that Mercer had learned from the Haudenosaunee. The 5 hearths kept the interior temperature at 52 degrees, even as the outside plunged to 47 below. On the 4th day, Gunnar Halvorsen walked through the door. He was alone. His wife and 2 sons had been with him when the storm hit. They had tried to reach the barn to save the livestock. Gunnar had made it back to the house. His family had not. He stood in the entrance of the Longhouse, snow crusted to his beard, his eyes empty of everything except exhaustion. Mercer rose to meet him. "I looked for them," Halvorsen said. His voice was a croak. 3 days. I looked for 3 days." "You won't find them until spring," Mercer said. "I'm sorry." Halvorsen's legs gave out. He sat heavily on the packed earth floor, and for a long moment he didn't speak. 43 people watched in silence. "You told me," Halvorsen finally said. "You told me the roofs wouldn't hold. You told me to come here." "I told you. I didn't listen." Halvorsen looked up at the curved ceiling, at the bark panels glowing amber in the firelight. "I said your sticks and bark would scatter across the prairie. I said anyone inside would freeze." His voice broke. "My wife believed me. My sons believed me. They stayed in the house because I told them it was safe." Mercer knelt beside him. "You didn't know. You knew. You knew. And I didn't listen, and now my family is dead." Halvorsen grabbed Mercer's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "How did you know? How did you know this would work when everything I built, everything we all built, failed?" Mercer looked at the old man for a long moment. Then he sat down beside him. "Because I listened," he said. "To people who had survived winters like this for 1,000 years. To people your civilization was trying to erase. They knew things, Gunnar. They knew how to build, how to read the weather, how to live on this land. And no one would listen to them either." Halvorsen said nothing, but he didn't let go of Mercer's arm. The crisis deepened on the 5th day when Eric Lindgren stopped breathing. The boy had fought the fever for 3 days. Astrid had stayed beside him constantly, forcing water into his mouth, cooling his forehead with snow, keeping him wrapped in every blanket they could spare. But the infection had settled in his lungs, and on the morning of January 17th, his chest rose once and didn't rise again. Astrid screamed. The sound echoed through the Longhouse, a raw animal wail that silenced every conversation and froze every movement. She gathered her son's body in her arms and rocked him, her voice breaking into sobs that wouldn't stop. Mercer had seen death before. He had lost his own children, 2 daughters and a son, to the smallpox that swept through the Haudenosaunee in 1873. He knew the weight of a child in your arms, the terrible lightness that came after life left. He knew there were no words. He sat beside Astrid and said nothing. The other settlers watched from their platforms, some crying, others looking away. Little Marta, Eric's younger sister, crept forward and touched her brother's hand. "Is he with Papa now?" she asked. Astrid couldn't answer. Mercer put his arm around her shoulders. "Yes," he said. "He's with his father." They couldn't bury Eric. The ground was frozen solid, the snow too deep. They wrapped his body in a blanket and placed him in the coldest corner of the Longhouse, where the temperature stayed below freezing. He would wait there until spring, when the earth could receive him. The loss changed something in the survivors. The abstract had become concrete. The storm wasn't just destroying buildings, it was killing children. Every person in that Longhouse understood, with brutal clarity, what would have happened if the sod roofs had been their only shelter. Eric Lindgren was the only person to die inside the Longhouse. Outside, across Dakota Territory, between 235 and 500 people froze to death in the Schoolhouse Blizzard of 1888. Many of them were children, caught between school and home in a whiteout that made navigation impossible. A 70-year-old farmer froze to death 12 feet from his own front door. A teacher in Nebraska led her students into the storm and lost half of them before finding shelter. Another teacher burned the school desks and chairs to keep her students alive through the night. In Dalton Crossing, 46 people survived because one man built a structure no one believed in. The temperature stayed below 20 degrees for 10 days. On January 18th, the community ran out of flour. On the 19th, the last of the dried meat was divided into portions so small they barely qualified as food. By the 20th, people were eating soup made from boiled leather straps and tree bark, the same bark that covered the walls above their heads. Mercer rationed the firewood with mathematical precision, 1 cord per day for 5 fires. 24 cords remained after the first week. At that rate, they had 24 days of heat. If the cold lasted longer, they would start burning the sleeping platforms. But the cold didn't last longer. On January 22nd, the temperature climbed above zero for the first time in 10 days. By the 24th, it reached 20 degrees. The drifts began to settle. The sun appeared pale and cold, but visible. People emerged from the Longhouse like animals leaving a den. They stood blinking in the white light, looking at a world that had been transformed. Snow covered everything to a depth of 4 feet, with drifts twice that height against every vertical surface. The settlement was unrecognizable, a landscape of white mounds where houses had stood, broken poles jutting from drifts where fences had been. The Halvorsen homestead was buried to the roofline. The door had been blocked by a drift so solid it would take 2 days to dig through. If Gunnar hadn't left to search for his family, if he had stayed inside, trusting his cottonwood rafters, he would have suffocated or frozen, trapped in a tomb of his own construction. They found his wife and sons a week later when the snow began to thaw. The bodies were 200 yards from the barn, still holding hands. The recovery took months, but the recriminations took longer. Reverend Crane arrived in Dalton Crossing on February 3rd, riding a circuit that had been interrupted by the storm. He found the settlement transformed. 21 families now living in or around a single structure, the sod houses abandoned or collapsed, the social order inverted. The Longhouse stood at the center of everything. Mercer had opened it permanently, not just as emergency shelter, but as a community building, a gathering place, a shared resource. Families who had lost their homes slept there while rebuilding. Those whose houses still stood used it for storage, for meetings, for warmth on the coldest nights. Crane stood before the structure and felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. "I called this an abomination," he said. Mercer was on the roof, repairing a smoke flap that had been damaged by ice. He didn't come down. "You did." "I said anyone who entered would answer to God." "I heard you." Crane looked at the settlement, at the families working together to clear snow, at the children playing near the Longhouse entrance, at the widowed men and women who had lost everything except their lives. You sheltered them when their own homes failed. You fed them when the food ran out. The Longhouse sheltered them. The community fed each other. I just built the building. Crane was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller than Mercer had ever heard it. "I have been preaching for 20 years, Crane said. "I have condemned many things, the savages, the pagans, the ways of the heathen. I believed I was serving God." He looked up at Mercer. "What does it mean when the heathen ways save Christian children and Christian houses kill them?" Mercer finally climbed down from the roof. He stood before Crane, his face unreadable. "It means maybe God doesn't care about the shape of the roof," Mercer said. "Maybe he just cares whether the people inside survive." Crane left without preaching. He never returned to Dalton Crossing. Peter Olmsted was the first to adopt the technique. He had spent the blizzard in his own sod house, praying as the roof groaned above him, watching the center beam bow under a weight it was never meant to carry. The roof hadn't collapsed, barely, but Olmsted had spent 3 days certain that every creak would be his last. A week after the storm, he appeared at the Longhouse with a notebook and a request. "Teach me," he said. Mercer looked at the carpenter who had dismissed his design 8 months ago. The man who had said saplings couldn't bear weight, that bent sticks would scatter across the prairie. "What changed your mind?" Olmsted's jaw tightened. "I spent 72 hours listening to my roof die. I spent 72 hours thinking about how I told you this wouldn't work." He met Mercer's eyes. "I was wrong. You were right. Now teach me how to build it." Mercer taught him. Over the following weeks, he taught anyone who asked the engineering principles, the bark harvesting techniques, the double-frame system that held the structure together. He didn't charge. He didn't lecture. He simply showed them what the Haudenosaunee had developed over 1,000 years, adapted for the prairie, simplified for settlers who had no idea they were learning ancient knowledge. By spring, 3 families had built barrel-vaulted additions to their sod houses, curved roofs that would shed snow instead of collecting it. By summer, 2 entirely new longhouses stood on claims north of Dalton Crossing, smaller than Mercer's original, but built on the same principles. Gunnar Halvorsen never built another flat roof. His new house, constructed on the site where he had found his wife and sons, had a curved top made of bark and saplings, shallower than the Longhouse, but steep enough to shed the winter loads. He didn't call it a Longhouse. He didn't credit the source in public. But every night before he slept, he looked up at that curve and remembered the structure that had saved him when his own had killed his family. The design spread beyond Dalton Crossing. Travelers carried stories of the settlement that had survived the Schoolhouse Blizzard with a single death, a miracle in a disaster that killed hundreds. Some stories mentioned Mercer. Some mentioned the Longhouse. Most mentioned neither, attributing the survival to God's grace or good luck or Scandinavian stubbornness. Mercer didn't care about credit. He had built the Longhouse for one reason: to save lives that would otherwise be lost. 46 people had survived in a valley where the mathematics of sod construction should have killed them. The knowledge was spreading. The failures were being corrected. That was enough. Silas Mercer lived in Dalton Crossing for another 11 years. He never rebuilt the Longhouse after it finally collapsed in a windstorm in 1894. The bark had rotted. The saplings had dried and cracked. The structure had simply reached the end of its natural life. By then, every remaining house in the settlement had a sloped roof of some kind. The lesson had been learned. He died on March 15, 1899, at the age of 65. The cause was pneumonia, an infection that settled in lungs weakened by decades of frontier living. He was buried in the Dalton Crossing Cemetery, next to Eric Lindgren and the Halvorsen family, under a headstone that read simply, Silas Mercer, builder. Astrid Lindgren paid for the stone. She had remarried in 1892 to Peter Olmsted, as it happened, and had 2 more children, but she never forgot the winter of '88, or the man who had built shelter when no one else would. On January 12, 1888, the temperature in Dakota Territory dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. By nightfall, it was 40 below zero, and the wind was tearing roofs from houses and children from their parents' arms. In Dalton Crossing, a man named Gunnar Halvorsen had looked at a structure made of bent saplings and tree bark and told its builder, "Your sticks and bark will scatter across the prairie like paper. Anyone inside will freeze to death." The sticks did not scatter. The bark did not tear. 46 people crowded into a 100-foot tunnel that Halvorsen had called an abomination, and they survived 10 days of cold that killed hundreds across the northern plains. 22 years later, when the last witness to that night was an old woman named Anna, who had been 12 years old at the time, a newspaper reporter asked her what she remembered most about the Schoolhouse Blizzard. She thought for a long moment. "The sound," she finally said. "The wind was so loud you couldn't hear yourself scream. But inside that longhouse, inside Silas Mercer's Indian tunnel, it was quiet. Not silent, but quiet. You could hear the fires crackling. You could hear people breathing. You could hear children sleeping." She paused. "I remember thinking, this is what safe sounds like. This is what it sounds like to not die." She looked out the window at the prairie, flat and empty and covered in snow. "I never forgot that sound," she said. "I'm 80 years old, and I still hear it when the wind blows.